Welcome to the Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up, the podcast where open-source reporting meets informed, expert intelligence analysis. This week, Neil Bisson, the director of the Global Intelligence Knowledge Network and a retired CSIS intelligence officer, examines how hostile state activity is accelerating across every corner of Canada's national security landscape. We start in the United Kingdom, where a journalist finds themselves at the center of a Secret Service probe linked to Chinese intelligence networks. Here at home, Canadian Security Intelligence Service Director Dan Rogers delivers one of the most consequential intelligence speeches in recent memory. The director warns that Russia and China are dramatically stepping up their operations in Canada's Arctic, exploiting our geography, infrastructure gaps, and global competition for the North. The director's first ever annual speech also revealed stunning domestic shifts. Nearly 1 in 10 terrorism investigations now involves a minor, as radicalization pipelines push deeper into Canada's youth. And for the first time, CSIS publicly acknowledged disrupting potentially lethal plots by Iranian intelligence services against individuals inside Canada. And overseas, a major act of sabotage on a key Polish rail line, one vital to aid delivery in Ukraine, shows how Europe's hybrid conflict is expanding into direct attacks on allied infrastructure. Together, these stories paint a clear picture. The threats facing Canada and its partners are converging, evolving, and increasingly operating across multiple domains at once. What are you waiting for? Let's get started.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up. I'm your host, Neil Bisson. As a retired intelligence officer with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the director of the Global Intelligence Knowledge Network, I take the top stories on espionage, sabotage, foreign interference, and terrorism and break them down with analysis and insights to give you the intelligence you need to make sense of an ever-increasingly dangerous world. We've had a busy week, from the CSIS director's first annual speech to sabotage attacks on railways in Poland. There's a lot to discuss, so let's dive in. For our first segment this week, we head to the United Kingdom, where there's been a startling development with the potentially far-reaching implications for press freedom and intelligence state relations. A journalist working for BBC is reportedly being investigated by UK Secret Service agencies in connection with alleged ties to Chinese espionage activity. According to the article, the inquiry is still unfolding, but the mere fact that a media professional is being subject to state intelligence probe raises critical questions about how democratic states balance national security concerns with the role of independent journalism. This case illustrates multiple layers of complexity. On one level, it underscores the espionage threat posed by People's Republic of China that is shifting out of traditional military or industrial theft domains and into the realm of influence and information operations, places where journalists, academics, and other communicators may find themselves under scrutiny, either deliberately or inadvertently. For example, being a conduit of information or having access to networks of influence can make a journalist vulnerable to recruitment or exploitation, or at least the target of suspicion. On another level, the investigation raises an uncomfortable tension. If journalists can be the subject of a counterintelligence investigation simply by the nature of their role or contacts, how does a government ensure that press freedom isn't compromised in the same name of security? The balance here is delicate. Democratic governments must protect sensitive national security interests, yet they also must safeguard the independence of media and avoid chilling effects on investigative journalism or foreign reporting. In this instance, the article notes that the journalist's exact role, alleged activities, or the evidence underpinning the probe remain opaque. Observers suggest that the mere announcement of such an investigation sends multiple messages to adversary states that the UK, and by extension other Western states, are alert to intelligence penetration. Journalists and media organizations that the protective mantle of the newsroom is not immune to the intelligence world, and to domestic audiences that national security threats now include more subtle, less visible forms of influence than perhaps they previously understood. Historically, Western intelligence services have targeted journalism in limited ways, monitoring communication, cultivating sources, or recruiting assets. But public acknowledgement of investigation against journalists, especially in connection with foreign state espionage, remains rare and controversial. The UK has seen earlier cases of journalist surveillance and government intrusion into media communications, which has sparked debates about the rule of law and rights protection. For Canada and its allies, the timing of the story is significant. As we see expanding foreign intelligence activity, whether by Russia, China, Iran, or others, The vulnerability of open societies to recruitment or penetration of traditionally safe zones, academia, journalism, think tanks, etc., grows. The possibility that a journalist might be under investigation for espionage-related reasons should raise the alarm in Ottawa as much as in London, that the open societies we value are also being targeted in new ways. Analysts warn that while national security agencies must have tools to investigate potential threats, the criteria for pursuing such cases must be transparent, systematic, and subject to oversight, especially when they involve members of the free press. Some point out the ambiguity and secrecy around investigations can lead to guilt by association, outcomes whereby journalists and foreign contacts may be fairly stigmatized or self-censored. Others note a more strategic dimension. When democracies publicly reveal investigations of journalists tied to foreign intelligence, they are deploying a form of deterrence. The message to potential adversaries is, we're watching. But the risk is that the deterrence may come at a cost of media independence and public trust if not managed within a clear legal and ethical framework. This emerging story of a BBC journalist under investigation for alleged ties to Chinese intelligence is more than a media industry drama. It's a warning sign that the front line of intelligence competition may include the realm of journalism, and that democratic societies must strengthen their framework to protect both national security and press freedom. For Canada, the takeaway is unmistakable. State-sponsored intelligence threats are increasingly entering domains once considered outside the purview of national security agencies, and the response must be equally comprehensive, integrating intelligence, legal, civil society, and media sector strategies. For the next few segments, we'll go to Canada, where we discuss the various points made by CSIS Director Dan Rogers on his first annual speech. We start with the growing strategic concern, an increase in espionage efforts by both Russia and China targeting the Arctic region. During his speech, CSIS Director Dan Rogers warned that Canada's Northern Territories, long overlooked in national security conversations, is now drawing significant intelligence interest from hostile states. The news article outlines how both countries are using a mix of cyber operations, front companies, and human intelligence recruitment to exploit Canada's vulnerabilities in the far north. Rogers paints a clear picture. The Arctic has evolved into one of the world's most contested geopolitical spaces, and Canada is firmly in the crosshairs. According to CSIS, Russian intelligence services have been leveraging front companies based in Europe to acquire Canadian-origin goods and sensitive technology to support Moscow's military machinery. These procurement schemes are designed to circumvent sanctions while allowing Russia to quietly siphon off high-value capabilities that Canadian firms produce. China's activities are no less concerning. CSIS notes increasing attempts by Chinese entities to recruit Canadians, particularly those with military or technical backgrounds, to support Beijing's intelligence objectives. For China, strategic competition in the Arctic is part of a broader effort to expand its influence in regions traditionally dominated by Western nations. Taken together, these efforts reflect a coordinated push by Russia and China to gather intelligence, gain access to critical infrastructure, and prepare the ground for a long-term strategic advantage. From an intelligence perspective, this is entirely predictable. As climate change opens new shipping routes and exposes previously inaccessible resources, the Arctic's value grows economically, militarily, and geopolitically. That makes Canada's Northern Territories a prime target not only for espionage, but for influence operations and covert access. Canada's renewed attention to Arctic sovereignty has not gone unnoticed. Ottawa has committed roughly $1 billion to support infrastructure projects in the region, a long overdue investment given decades of underfunding. However, the sudden recognition of the Arctic's importance has also highlighted how vulnerable Canada remains. The reality is how much of Canada's Arctic infrastructure, from ports to communication systems, lags behind that of other circumpolar states. Sparse population, limited surveillance capabilities, and vast distances makes the region difficult to monitor or defend. These gaps create an ideal environment for foreign adversaries to test batteries, probe networks, or cultivate contacts under the pretext of scientific cooperation or commercial partnership. This isn't an isolated trend. Russia has already heavily militarized its Arctic coast, while China has repeatedly declared itself a near-Arctic state, a term it invented to justify deeper involvement in northern affairs. The intelligence activities we are now seeing in Canada fits into broader geopolitical ambitions. Security professionals and Arctic analysts have long warned that Canada's north represents one of the country's softest targets. They point out that the combination of climate-driven access, under-resource monitoring, and expanding foreign interests set the stage for increased espionage, cyber intrusion, and covert influence activity. Experts also caution that many of the risks are not obvious at first glance. Partnerships that appear benign, such as research collaborations, mineral exploration deals, or scientific data exchanges, can serve as vehicles for foreign intelligence services. And unlike traditional intelligence collection, these activities often sit in the gray zone between commerce and espionage, making them hard to identify and regulate. From an intelligence practitioner's perspective, this shift represents a significant challenge. Hostile states are not simply gathering information. They are shaping the environment in ways that could give them future leverage over Canada's strategic infrastructure and Arctic governance. Canada's Arctic is no longer a remote or a purely symbolic frontier. It is now a front line of global competition. The increase in Russian and Chinese spy activity underscores an urgent need for Canada to modernize its surveillance capabilities, bolster its northern infrastructure, and strengthen partnerships with Indigenous communities who play a central role in regional security. If Canada fails to keep pace, it risks losing both situational awareness and influence in a region that is becoming more strategically vital year by year. As global powers converge on the north, Canada must ensure its sovereignty is backed not just by policy statements, but by a robust intelligence, security, and infrastructure capability of withstanding the pressure of an increasingly contested Arctic. We'll stick with the information coming out of the Director's speech for the next segment. Canadian Security Intelligence Service Director Daniel Rogers revealed the troubling shift in the domestic counterterrorism landscape. Nearly 1 in 10 active investigations now includes at least one subject under the age of 18. The disclosure highlights just how early extremist recruitment and radicalization are occurring in Canada, a trend few anticipated and one many observers believe signals deeper structural security risks. For decades, Canada's primary counterterrorism focus has rested on adult actors, individuals mobilized by foreign terrorist organizations or homegrown networks. But the Director's remarks indicate a departure from this trend. The involvement of minors in investigations is no longer exceptional, it's increasingly common. Younger Canadians are now being targeted, or at least implicated, in trajectories that may lead toward violent extremism or support roles in terrorist networks. This development is significant on several fronts. First, it raises questions about the nature of recruitment pipelines, such as, are extremist ideologies increasingly appealing to younger demographic? And are online platforms further lowering the barrier to entry for radical participation? CSIS's data suggests that the threshold is dropping. Second, it challenges the existing tools and methods of integration and intervention. Traditional counterterrorism mechanisms, intelligence collection, threat disruption, interagency coordination, were never designed with minors in mind. This places CSIS and the Canadian law enforcement at a disadvantage. Dan Rogers has emphasized that these cases are not confined to any one ideology or community. The recruitment mechanisms differ, from simple online grooming to complex affinity networks, but the outcome is the same. Vulnerable youths are becoming nodes in the intelligence and security space. This means that Canadian security policy must adjust, not just in terms of detection and disruption, but in prevention, education, and community resilience. The surge in juvenile involvement comes against a backdrop of persistent threat evolution. While earlier waves featured well-defined extremist organizations, today's threats often appear in fluid forms: lone actors, hybrid networks, digitally enabled, or ideologically fragmented. CSIS has repeatedly warned that the threat environment has changed. Adversaries are exploiting new access points, including social media and clandestine recruitment. In that light, minors are not simply new targets, but express the broader shift towards a low-cost, high-impact extremist engagement. In parallel, Canada's social and digital landscapes have evolved dramatically. Youth engagement online has soared. Anonymity and virality have become tools of radicalization, and community ties, which traditionally acted as buffers, are under strain. These structural changes imply that the pool of vulnerable individuals is larger and more diffuse, complicating detection and intervention. Security analysts interpret Rogers' disclosure as a wake-up call. They argue that age-appropriate prevention strategies are urgently needed. For instance, school-based programs, digital literacy campaigns, and collaboration with Indigenous and remote communities where conventional outreach may not reach. Some experts also note that the privacy and civil rights dimension, investigating minors requires special care, and balance between security and rights becomes even more delicate. Others point out that CSIS's involvement in cases with minors suggests a blurring of the line between criminal justice and national security. Historically, cases involving youth would be routed through the child protection or juvenile justice system. But here, they are elevated into the intelligence sphere. That raises governance questions. Which system leads? Who intervenes? and how are the outcomes measured? The revelation by CSIS that around 10% of its counterterrorism investigations now involve minors is both alarming and instructive. It signals that Canada's extremist threat is adapting, and in doing so, drawing in a younger generation. For policymakers, this message is clear. Counterterrorism cannot remain confined to intelligence agencies and uniformed responses. It must expand to include education, community engagement, digital oversight, and youth-centric intervention. If Canada fails to evolve alongside the threat, it risks having a pipeline of radicalized young Canadians ready for mobilization, a scenario that shifts the national security calculus in ways few anticipated just a decade ago. In his first public annual speech, Dan Rogers disclosed that CSIS intervened this year to thwart potentially lethal threats posed by Iranian intelligence services against individuals residing in Canada. The announcement marks the first time that CSIS has explicitly acknowledged such operations on Canadian soil. Rogers informed the audience that in one or more, quote, particularly alarming cases, unquote, CSIS had detected, investigated, and disrupted plots by Iranian intelligence services and proxy actors directed at persons in Canada whom Tehran considered adversaries of the regime. While Rogers did not provide specifics on targets, methods, or timing, his remarks signal a significant shift. Canada is no longer merely monitoring Iranian threats abroad. CSIS has had to step in actively to protect individuals within Canada from state-sponsored violent action. Alongside the Iranian threat, Rogers noted concurrent Russian efforts to acquire Canadian goods and technology via Europe-based front companies, a reminder that Canada now faces a multi-vector intelligence threat environment. The intertwining of state-sponsored kinetic risks, such as assassination or violent disruption, with procurement and influence operations represents a paradigm shift for Canadian national security architecture. So why does this matter? Historically, Canada has considered itself relatively safe from this kind of targeted foreign state violence seen in Europe and the United States. That assumption is now being challenged. If a regime like Iran is willing and capable to mount lethal threats against Canadian residents and citizens, it demands a reassessment of what it means to protect Canadian territory, not just from terrorism, but from foreign intelligence services. Moreover, this development raises questions about the protective posture for diaspora communities, asylum seekers, critics abroad, and Canadian-based opponents of authoritarian regimes. Canada has already had tense relations with Iran. Ottawa severed diplomatic ties in 2012, and in 2024 designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, as a terrorist entity. This director's disclosure effectively elevates the issue from policy and sanctions to operational counterintelligence on Canadian soil. Regionally and globally, Western intelligence agencies have similarly warned of Iranian intelligence services employing assassinations, kidnappings, and proxy attacks against dissidents. The fact that CSIS now claims to have disrupted such threats domestically places Canada in the same risk category. From an operational standpoint, the intervention suggests that Canadian intelligence and law enforcement partners were able to detect, surveil, and interrupt activities that had progressed beyond simple surveillance or influence. Whether these were plots to kill, abduct, or to intimidate remains unstated. But the phrase, quote, potentially lethal, unquote, cannot be read as anything but serious. For Canada's diaspora and expatriate communities, particularly those with connections to Iran, this raises concerns about their security and the adequacy of the state's protective mechanisms. Security analysts view this public acknowledgement as a wake-up call. Many argue that Canada's intelligence framework has long been structured around counterterrorism and cyber espionage, but not necessarily direct assassination threats by foreign regimes. This announcement forces Canada to treat hostile state threats in the same category as domestic terrorism and espionage. Some experts emphasize the challenge of balancing civil liberties protections with proactive investigations in such cases, especially when targets may be journalists, activists, or exiles with overlapping rights concerns. Others underline that the diaspora context complicates things. Individuals targeted by regimes may not have full awareness of the risk or the resources to protect themselves, and state responses may need to be tailored accordingly. The revelation that CSIS foiled potentially lethal Iranian state attacks on Canadian territory underscores just how elevated and direct the threat environment has become for Canada. It frames the issue not as abstract foreign interference, but as immediate risks to persons inside the country. For policy and operational planners, the implications are clear. Canada must bolster protective measures for at-risk individuals improve intelligence sharing across agencies, and integrate counterintelligence strategies that reflect a broader spectrum of foreign state violence. In a world where regime adversaries are no longer fighting wars only abroad but acting inside Canada's borders, the distinction between foreign policy and domestic security is increasingly blurred. In the same address from the director, CSIS warned that foreign states are actively preparing for potential interference in Canada's democratic processes, with special attention to the possibility of upcoming provincial referendums in regions such as Alberta and Quebec. The message, foreign intelligence activity is no longer confined to federal elections but may extend into subnational votes and referendums where strategic advantages can be gained. The CSIS alert marks a shift in how Canada must view democratic process vulnerability. For decades, Canada's intelligence focus has centered on federal general elections, the big, visible national contest. But now, CSIS is signaling that referendums in provincial votes, which often receive less scrutiny, are emerging as hotspots for foreign influence. Here's what makes this change significant. 1. Scope of threat. Interfering in a provincial referendum offers foreign actors lower risk, lower visibility, but potentially high reward, especially if the outcome can influence regional policy, trade access, resource control, or seed domestic instability. Targeting of local processes. Provincial referendums involve small electorates, less media attention, and weaker procedural protections compared with national elections. That makes them attractive for covert influence campaigns. And finally, strategic leverage. If an adversary can influence a provincial referendum outcome, the ripple effect may extend to federal politics, resource and infrastructure decisions, or alignments with major powers. In short, impacting the, quote, smaller game may pay dividends in the bigger game. CSIS emphasized that the tools and techniques of foreign interference are evolving, more of online platforms, diaspora networks, community groups, plus disinformation and proxy organizations. It also warned that the lead time for influence operations is lengthening, meaning preparatory work may begin well ahead of the formal vote date. Canada has already faced growing scrutiny over foreign interference and its federal democratic processes. A public inquiry found that several states, including China, India, and Russia, have attempted to influence Canadian politics through funding, disinformation, and procurement networks. The inquiry concluded that, while the direct impact on election outcomes was limited, the threat itself is persistent and evolving. The notion of interference in referendums marks the next frontier. Provincial sovereignty questions, for example in Alberta or Quebec, regional policy votes, or resource development plebiscites create opportunities for foreign actors to exploit local divisions. Given Canada's open society and multi-layer governance, provincial votes can be stepping stones for broader influence campaigns. Analysts note that CSIS's warning is timely and necessary. It underscores the need to shift from a reflective election scrutiny mindset to a broader democratic resilience posture that incorporates referendums, local votes, civil society groups, and diaspora engagement. Some experts highlight the importance of early warning indicators. Engagement by foreign-funded civil organizations in provincial politics, shifts in online narratives on regional issues, sudden influxes of investments tied to referendums, etc. Others caution about balancing security and democratic openness. Provincial governments and civil society must ensure the integrity of the vote without undermining public trust or shutting down legitimate debate. They argue for stronger intergovernmental coordination, federal, provincial intelligence sharing, reinforce local media literacy, and designated mechanisms to monitor disinformation ahead of votes. CSIS's public warning that foreign interference may target provincial referendums signals a turning point in Canada's democratic security landscape. No longer is the threat confined to federal elections. Regional votes and referendums are targets as well. For Canada, this means defense and democratic integrity must be broadened. The work is not just about counting ballots on election day, but about safeguarding the full ecosystem, including local campaigns, civil society, online discourse, investment flows, and cross-border influence from creeping external manipulation. Let's take a deeper reading of the remarks by the director of CSIS, focusing not just on what he said in a recent public address, but what he didn't say, and what that omission might tell us about Canada's intelligence diplomacy in an increasingly contested world. Analysts suggest that the director's measured tone reflects a careful balancing act, signaling resolve to adversaries while avoiding escalation or diplomatic blow-ups. When Rogers laid out the CSIS's annual threat assessment, he highlighted three major adversarial vectors. 1. Russian procurement efforts. 2. Chinese attempts to recruit Canadians with expertise. And 3. Iranian state-linked plots that allegedly targeted Canadians. What stood out is how he framed these threats. Direct, serious, unambiguous. But just as important was his choice of language and what he omitted. No attribution of specific names, no public detailed disclosure of methods, no mention of certain partner states, and minimal commentary on the broader foreign policy responses. Analysts interpret this careful calibration as an instance of intelligence diplomacy. On one hand, Canada is engaging in a public posture, letting the world know that hostile state espionage and violent coercion are not abstract risks, but immediate and real. On the other hand, by keeping details vague, Rogers leaves space for behind-the-scenes diplomacy, joint agency coordination with allies, and quiet retaliation or deterrence options without locking Ottawa into a specific line of action. In effect, the omissions function as a signal. For example, not naming specific companies or front firms limits legal exposure and preserves ongoing investigation. Not naming specific Iranian or Russian actors gives Canada freedom to escalate privately, to impose sanctions, expel diplomats, or build counterintelligence operations without public commitments. By choosing this path, the message to both adversaries and allies is clear. Canada sees you. You're on the radar, but this fight will continue in the shadows, for now. Canada's intelligence posture has historically leaned towards restraint, publicly calling out threats when politically necessary and preferring alliances, such as the Five Eyes and NATO, for major counterintelligence work. What the director's remarks reflect is a shift. More public acknowledgement of adversary activity, which itself is a deterrence tool, but also a continuation of Canada's preference for indirect action over public grandstanding. This trend coincides with other development. Canada's Arctic strategy, heightened concerns over diaspora targeting threats, and growing scrutiny of foreign procurement of Canadian technology. All of these put Ottawa at the intersection of intelligence, diplomacy, and trade, demanding a nuance balancing openness and secrecy. The choice to emphasize certain adversarial vectors while omitting others suggests Canada is calibrating its public message framework to support that balance. Security commentators note that one of the key advantages of Rogers' approach is flexibility. By signaling broadly rather than pointing fingers in detail, Canada retains options. It allows Ottawa to preserve leverage, engage with partners quietly, and avoid being boxed into publicly committed responses. Some caution, however, that the risk of this approach is credibility. Repeated broad warnings without any public action may erode the deterrent effect over time. Another view is that this form of light public signaling supports Canada's middle power diplomacy. Analysts argue that Canada wants to highlight adversarial behavior to reassure domestic audiences and international partners, while simultaneously maintaining space for diplomatic engagement with adversarial states, especially where Canada may need to negotiate on other fronts. What the director didn't say tells us nearly as much as what he did. The omissions, specific names, explicit attribution are strategic. They reflect a Canada that recognizes the adversary environment is evolving and highly complex, and that it must act in multiple dimensions: intelligence, diplomacy, trade, technology, community resilience. By signaling the threat publicly while preserving room for nuance and private response, Ottawa is walking a fine line between deterrence and diplomacy, between visibility and discretion. For policymakers and intelligence planners alike, the key takeaway is that Canada's security messaging is now part of the strategic landscape. Not just what we say, but what we choose not to say. Before we move on to our last segment, it's worth stepping back and looking at the bigger national security picture that CSIS Director Dan Rogers laid out in his recent public address, because every one of today's stories fits into the landscape he described. The Director highlighted four major trends shaping Canada's threat environment. 1. Canada is now facing multi-vector pressure from hostile states. China, Russia, and Iran are active in different and overlapping ways, including procurement networks, espionage targeting Canadians with specialized knowledge, and even plots aimed at harming individuals on Canadian soil. 2. The threat environment is expanding into areas Canadians never expected. Nearly 1 in 10 CSIS terrorism investigations now involves a minor, showing how radicalization pipelines, particularly online, are pulling in younger Canadians and creating new vulnerabilities that traditional counter-terror tools weren't built for. 3. Canada's democratic processes are becoming a focal point for foreign interference. Not only are federal elections being targeted, but provincial referendums and regional political debates are increasingly viewed as lower visibility opportunities for foreign states to shape Canadian outcomes. 4. CSIS is increasingly operating at the intersection of intelligence, diplomacy, and public communication. Rogers' public warnings function both as deterrent and as a quiet messaging. Rogers' public warnings function both as deterrence and as quiet messaging, signaling awareness of hostile activities while preserving flexibilities for private or covert responses. Together, these points underscore something crucial. Canada's national security challenges are evolving quickly, crossing multiple domains and touching Canadians directly. From our northern sovereignty to the online ecosystem shaping our youth, to democratic institutions, and even to targeted threats against individuals inside our borders. For our last segment this week, we end in Poland, where a recent explosion along the Warsaw-Lublin rail line, a route critical to transporting humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine, has become a target of unprecedented sabotage. The blast caused damage to both tracks and overhead cables, prompting Prime Minister Donald Tusk to declare that the attack was a direct strike to Polish national security. He vowed to pursue those responsible, quote, regardless of who the backers are, unquote. This incident represents a significant escalation in the broader hybrid conflict surrounding the war in Ukraine. First, the choice of target is telling. This railway line is the backbone of the logistical chain supporting Ukraine's defense. An attack on this infrastructure is effectively an attack on the international effort to sustain Ukraine's fight. Second, Polish officials have stated that the likelihood of foreign intelligence involvement is, quote, very high. The language used by the Polish government makes references to, quote, foreign state services and an unprecedented act of sabotage, moving the incident firmly into the domain of counterintelligence and gray zone tactics rather than ordinary criminality. Third, the blast signals a worrying shift in the conflict. For years, hostile activity has included cyber intrusion, disinformation campaigns, and covert influence efforts. This event demonstrates a willingness to move towards kinetic sabotage on NATO territory, specifically targeting the supply lines that sustain Ukraine's war effort. It expands the battlefield beyond Ukraine's borders, sending a clear message that Allied infrastructure is not off limits. The explosion occurred along a stretch of track roughly 100 kilometers southeast of Warsaw, on a route frequently used to move aid toward the Ukrainian border. No casualties were reported, but the nature and precision of the damage indicated deliberate and well-coordinated attack. Poland has since announced military inspections of a large section of track to assess whether there are additional vulnerabilities. This incident fits within the broader pattern of hybrid pressure on countries supporting Ukraine. Poland, as one of the primary transport hubs for both humanitarian assistance and military equipment, has faced persistent probing attempts designed to destabilize its logistical and political environment. A direct attack on its railway infrastructure highlights the degree to which adversaries are prepared to disrupt Western support to Ukraine by targeting transit states. Security analysts view this as more than a single act of sabotage. Many believe it is a calculated test designed to identify weak points in Polish infrastructure, force Poland to divert resources into protection and repair, and demonstrate that even NATO territory can be touched. It also puts pressure on Western governments, forcing them to reassess the security of the supply chain to Ukraine and determine whether additional countermeasures are now needed to deter further action. Some experts caution that unless transit infrastructure is fortified, similar attempts may follow. Others argue that Poland's very public response is itself a form of deterrent, making clear that such operations will not be hidden, downplayed, or tolerated. This railway sabotage is a warning that the conflict's reach is widening. Support routes to Ukraine are now contested spaces, vulnerable to disruption by hostile states seeking to undermine Western solidarity. For Canada and other NATO allies, the implications are clear. Protecting infrastructure, strengthening intelligence cooperation, and hardening supply lines must now be part of the broader defense strategy. What happened in Poland could easily be attempted against other countries supporting Ukraine, including Canada. Well, that's it for this week's wrap-up. I'd like to remind my listeners that I have an upcoming online course for the Professional Development Institute National Security and Intelligence Program for the University of Ottawa. The course is Proxy Operations and Sabotage in Modern Intelligence, and given the increase in the threat environment discussed by the Director of CSIS, I highly recommend anyone involved in government policy, private industry security, or the Canadian Armed Forces to consider this course. I'll leave a link in the transcript in the show note. So until next week, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.
That wraps up this week's Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up. Thank you for joining us. This week, we looked at the investigation of a BBC journalist in the UK, highlighting how foreign intelligence activity is reaching deeper into democratic institutions. we examined CSIS Director Dan Rogers' warnings about growing Russian and Chinese operations in Canada's Arctic, the rising involvement of minors in terrorism investigations, and the troubling revelation that Iranian intelligence plotted potentially lethal actions on Canadian soil. We also reviewed CSIS's alert about possible foreign interference in upcoming provincial referendums, and the sabotage of a key Polish rail line, a reminder that hybrid warfare is expanding into Allied infrastructure. Each of these stories shows how intelligence threats are becoming more immediate, more complex, and increasingly closer to home. Producing this podcast takes extensive research and analysis. If you find value in this work, please consider supporting the show through Buzzsprout. Your contribution helps keep the Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up independent and sustainable. Don't forget to subscribe, share the show, and leave a like and a review. Until next week, and as Neil always reminds us, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.